Right, welcome back to U.S. History Lecture Videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to be talking about the Cold War. So we are in the post-World War II era, and we're going to specifically talk about the Cold War, how an ally during World War II became an enemy after World War II. So specifically, today's goals are to explain how and why the Cold War emerged, and describe the steps taken by the U.S. government to oppose communism expansion and the government's efforts to root out communist influence in the United States. So first, just kind of a brief introduction, like what was the Cold War? Okay. So during World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies. We fought together against Germany, Italy, and Japan, the quote Axis powers. However, as the war ended, the partnership between the United States and the Soviet Union fell apart. Without a common enemy to unite them, they realized that they had very different visions for the future of Europe and the world, and this disagreement would shape global politics for the next 45 years in what is called the Cold War. So, two different visions, really strongly different visions. Joseph Stalin was the Soviet leader. He wanted to control Eastern Europe and spread communist governments throughout the region. He believed that this would protect the Soviet Union from future invasions and expand Soviet power. The United States wanted to promote democracy and free market economies. And communist governments are very much government controlled economies and markets. Okay, so these are very opposing ideas of how an economy and a government should rule. Let me rephrase that: how a government should rule and how much control they should have in the economy. So America made it a goal to limit Soviet influence and started to form alliances with nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America who wanted to also promote democracy. And so these competing, opposing goals made conflicts between these two countries almost inevitable. So for much of its history, the United States had avoided permanent foreign alliances. Remember, we've talked about multiple wars in which the United States tries to remain neutral and then doesn't. After World War II, the country kind of gives up on this, and it really changes dramatically. The president, Harry Truman, at the time, realizes that America can't stay isolated from world affairs anymore. We're too involved. After World War II, we're too interconnected, and many Americans felt like it was a moral obligation to promote democracy, stop the spread of communism, and sort of protect the countries of the world that were already democratic. Europe and Asia were devastated by the war and they needed American support. The war was fought physically in Europe and in Asia rather than on the United States' actual territory. And so the United States had an advantage in the fact that it wasn't physically decimated or destroyed after the war like much of Europe and Asia was. You know, much of London was bombed during World War II, and the United States didn't have any of that to deal with. And so they wanted to believed that they should support their allies in Europe and Asia. So there were several conferences at the end of World War II to try and bring peace, and that's going to eventually lead to the Cold War partly. So in July of 1945, the U.S. president met with Stalin and British leader in Germany. So he met with the Soviet leader and with the British leader, and they had ultimately been allies during World War II. But President Truman disagreed with Stalin's plan to demand heavy reparations from Germany. President Truman feared that punishing Germany too harshly would lead to another war, just as it had after World War I. And although they reached an agreement in Potsdam, Germany, this was the last time the superpowers would truly cooperate. And so they sort of realized their really strong differing views. And so essentially, the Cold War begins. And what is the Cold War? It's this long, decades long struggle between the United States and Soviet Union for global power and influence. It's referred to as the Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States never actually fought each other directly with armies. They competed through things like espionage, propaganda, political assassinations, the forming of alliance, and the development of weapons technology. Both nations raced to build the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons, sort of arguing that they weren't going to use it as an offensive, but in order to stop an offensive from the other side, they needed to have the defense to stop an offense, right? A country theoretically is less likely to attack you if they know that the retaliation would be terrible. And in order for the retaliation to be strong and terrible, the United States had to keep up its stockpile of weapons. We also supported wars in Korea, Vietnam, and other countries. We're going to get to the Vietnam War and the Korean War and some other lessons here, in which the United States chooses to support the side fighting against communism. And so all of these ways these were all the ways that the United States was quote unquote fighting a Cold War against the Soviet Union and communist leaders. In February 1946, a diplomat named George Kennan sent an important message called the Long Telegram to Washington, in which he argued that the Soviet Union wanted to destroy rival nations and expand its influence, and he recommended the United States contain Soviet power by preventing it from spreading. So this led to what was called the policy of containment, and this was the foundation of American foreign policy for over 30 years, containing the spread of communism. It was the reason and justification for many things, including our involvement in the Korean War and our involvement in the Vietnam War, which we'll talk about in more detail in other lessons. American leaders believed in something called the domino theory, that if one country fell to communism, others nearby would follow, and it would spread like a disease from nation to nation. And they used this theory to justify American military and economic involvement in many, many countries. So we've gone from remaining neutral and sort of isolationist to actively justifying putting our fingers and hands into many, many different pots throughout the world. And so this is going to continue to guide American policy for decades after World War II. It's a big sort of about sign, a complete 180 flip. Not only are we not trying to be involved, we're choosing to be involved on purpose and justifying it with a variety of reasons. So to support this, the United States reorganized the military and intelligence agencies. We see the establishment of the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency, to begin spying and gathering intelligence abroad. The Department of Air Force is created, which combined, and in 1949, all military branches were combined into the Department of Defense. And so the United States restructures and reorganizes its military to be stronger and more powerful than ever before, again, with sort of the Cold War and containment policy behind all of it as a motivator. In 1947, Great Britain announced it could no longer afford to support Greece in the civil war against communist rebels. So the President of the United States stepped in with the Truman Doctrine, which offered military and financial aid to Greece and Turkey. So this is where we see this policy taking effect. We're now supporting foreign countries who are fighting against communism. The president believed that if Greece and Turkey fell to communism, the whole region would be threatened, and he asked Congress for funds to help the nation resist communist takeover. And that sort of doctrine became part of the Cold War strategy. The Marshall Plan also took place after World War II. What was this? Well, Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed the European Recovery Program, also known as the Marshall Plan. And this was an economic supportive plan to help the United States allies in Europe, and again, those who would fight the spread of communism, to recover from the war. The plan required European countries to work together and spend much of the money provided by the United States on United States goods, which helped prevent the spread of communism in Western Europe and boosted the American economy. So for specifics, the United States gave $13 billion to help nations in Europe rebuild. All right, so one thing that happened during this time semi-immediately after the war was the Berlin blockade, so testing of the containment policy. So in 1948, the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, tried to force the Western powers out of West Berlin by cutting off all of its resources, land and water. He hoped to starve the city into submission and prove that the containment of communism would not work. Because again, Western powers are occupying Berlin, therefore it is not communist, right? It is democratic. Instead, the United States, Britain, and France flew in supplies by airplane for over a year. And a year later, Stalin had to admit defeat and end the blockade. This success led to the creation of NATO, which was a military alliance of Western nations committed to defending each other. So again, kind of that common enemy, bringing people together as allies to fight communism. While fighting communism abroad, the United States also became worried/paranoid about communist spies and sympathizers at home. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, which shocked Americans because they thought they were the only ones who had nuclear weapons. And so that terrified people. In that same year, communist forces won control of China, which also alarmed American leaders. Um, and then Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed that the State Department was filled with communists. And these fears led to many, many investigations of government workers and suspected communists in Hollywood. And so sort of that led to this fear, widespread fear, some paranoia that communists were just everywhere around the corner watching you and you couldn't trust anyone, which is going to lead to some problems we'll talk about in some later lessons. All right, so I'm going to briefly mention the Korean War, talk about this more, either in your textbook or in some other lessons. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. North Korea was communist, trying to convert South Korea to communism. And so the president of the United States sent American troops to defend South Korea, and again, with a containment policy, trying to prevent the spread of communism. American forces under a General Douglas MacArthur launched a successful invasion. But when Chinese forces entered the war, the conflict became too much, complicated and costly. Essentially, the war lasted 3 years, killed 5 million people, and ended in an armistice that left Korea essentially divided. And so, sort of like this war was fought for 3 years and killed 5 million people, and not much changed. But there's more details on this in your textbook if you are interested, specifically in the Korean War. So we're gonna wrap up there for today. We haven't even covered all the events, but you can start considering what do you think the most important events of the Cold War were, and how did the policy of containment shape American decisions? And what surprised you most about how Cold War fears affected American society? And we'll continue talking about this as we move forward through time. We keep revisiting the Cold War over the next 50 years of U.S. history because it affects the next 50 years of U.S. history until it finally comes to an end.